Okay. Thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure today to have Professor Satyajit Singh, a colleague and a friend. Professor Singh is, of course, professor in political science and global studies here at UCSB. He joined us about a year and a half ago after a long career in Delhi University and working at the World Bank and the UNDP. Extremely knowledgeable from the ground up on water resources management, decentralization, natural resources management more generally, and governance, particularly in rural India. Right? He's going to be talking to us about a very funny book written in 1968, but very, very insightful. Many things have changed since then, but probably more than those have not, more than have changed have not changed. And so look forward to hearing from Satyajit about what we can and cannot take for this and from this, and how he proposes we go ahead and use this as social scientists and scholars. So thank you very much, Satyajit. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Aashish, and thank you everyone for coming in, especially those who are up in the middle of the night. So Raag Darbari is actually what brings all of you here. And for someone like me who works in micropolitics, local institutions, and administration in rural India, this is a classic. And it is not very often that literature can be studied as a text of political ethnography. It is even rarer to read a vernacular literature from India as a guide to critique established theories of administration and policy making, and that is exactly what I'm planning to do here. This salient writing in the vernacular was not by a political figure, but a literary personality. A literary personality who might have been a tehsildar or an officer at a sub-district or a block level at the time when he wrote Raag Darbari. It is a satirical description of a fictional village life. But I think it lays down new ground, a new perspective in our understanding of administrative theory, politics, state capacity, and local governance. Now, there are two questions which I have always been asked. The first is, why should a discipline of political science be interested in a fiction to understand rural reality? And I think I should take you to a conversation I had with a cartoonist, you would have heard of him, called Sudhir Dhar. And Sudhir Dhar was in great admiration of a photographer called Raghu Rai. And Sudhir used to envy Raghu's photographs, and he used to say, your photographs are a better depiction of reality, as it seems to be a transparent depiction. And Raghu used to say, hey, to Sudhir, I am limited by my frame, the angle and the light, and also limited by how the reader or the viewer looks at the photograph. And what you can do is, in a composition, imagine something, bring in all the elements, and just with a brief message, you're able to depict a reality which is very different from what a photographer can do. And now I feel that a political scientist is quite like a photographer, and a cartoonist like a fiction writer. A fiction writer can interpret reality in all its elements, while a social scientist is constrained by the tools and methods that can be verified and triangulated. Neither can replace the other in the understanding of reality, but what they can do is project a more nuanced understanding of the same. While we are talking about Raag Darbari, there is a recent book which has been written by Jean Drèze and Luc Louret. It's called Rumble in the Village. It is based on Jean's writings in Palanpur when he was doing this work with Nick. No, it wasn't Nixter. Yeah, it was Nixter in Palanpur in the early 70s. Now, Jean's work is very much that of a note writer as a social scientist, and Raag Darbari is a work of fiction. So those of you who get to read it would also understand the difference in terms of how these two people approach, the two genres approach understanding reality. The other question, which I think a group like this would ask is, certainly Jan would ask, is why should a vernacular from India be of interest to students of global politics or global studies? And I will point to two reasons. One, it offers a non-Eurocentric perspective on administrative theory, a perspective that is not enshrined in Weberian rule-based rationality, not formulated on the Wilson principle of separation of power of policy and administration. And it too, it offers insights and lessons on concerns of state capacity. Now, discernments are required as we build non-elite, non-hierarchical, decentralized, democratic, and participatory governance institutions. And these are lessons which are not only pertinent to rural India, but those that fundamentally restructure principles of administration and state capacity around the world. And here I'll later in my work, I'll refer to some of the work I did at Governance and State Capacity advisor to the UNDP in the Asia Pacific region, where we talked about administrative and governance reforms to build more accountable and decentralized institutions of governance. So can we come to the next one, which talks about the four things which I'll be doing in the paper, which is question Eurocentrism in administrative theory. And I'm doing it, as I said, based on a vernacular written by a tehsildar in village India. The second, which I'm trying to do, is that have a negotiation with Weber's rationality and an ideal type Wilsonian separation of power of policy and administration. And I'm going to situate that with saying that, well, what Raag Darbari portrays is actually something which has a longer genre in Indian administration with quantitative political economy. An ideal type, which was also what was the Arthashastra, which was some kind of a suggestions to the king and an engagement of how the king would be able to deal with what you might call a dystopian reality, which is also projected in Raag Darbari. Now, while the emphasis of both Kautilya and Weber has been on what is called the first mile of administration, I am very keen to explore the last mile of administration and engage with the anatomy of micropolitics. And I will have a discussion on building state capacity at the last mile as an alternate to a centrally accountable bureaucracy, a bureaucracy as we've seen in Raag Darbari, or an administrative structure as we've seen in Raag Darbari, which is very easy for state capture. So the non-Eurocentric administrative architecture does not need to have roots in a colonial inheritance, which is extractive, centralized, hierarchical, and we need to appreciate newer possibilities of administrations with democratic institutions. I point out again that about 100 developing countries are experimenting with some form of decentralization of the other. And with an invocation of Raag Darbari, I wish to underline that reform designs of decentralization should not only be based on Weberian and Wilsonian principles, rather they should appreciate and engage with a dystopian reality which administrators meet. So instead of an administrative structure which is held hostage by the elites, as it is in Raag Darbari, I wish to explore the possibilities of a greater role of civil society to catalyze various administrative nodes for better administrative capacity, a building of state capacity with greater vertical and horizontal democratic and civic engagement. We could end with some thoughts on fiction, development, and post-truth society, but really I do not have time for that right now. So next, can we have the slide which shows the picture of the book, the Darbar rather. So what is Raag Darbari? It is a work of Hindi fiction based in an imaginary village called Shivpalganj in Uttar Pradesh. It is an important story for me of rural India, of local politics and administration. Srilal Shukla won the Sahitya Academy for this in 1969. This was written in 1968. And interestingly, in the initial years, Srilal Shukla insisted that this is a work of fiction. And perhaps this was again a fiction writer trying to get deniability and trying to project a picture of reality, but wanting complete deniability for that. It is a story which talks about local institutions, and I'm interested in the institutions of the college, the Panchayat, which is the village council, and the cooperative. He also talks about other institutions such as the judiciary and the police, amongst others, in this work. And as Vibor talks about, he also talks about medicine. So it is about how the politics of the local elite not only manages to take over these institutions, but subvert the entire developmental state and administration and make it a hub of clientelism, parochialism, and corruption. So that's what Raag Darbari does. It is a book which is very disturbing. And it is disturbing because it is written just 2 decades after independence, when we were still trying to create an administrative architecture. So most discussions on Raag Darbari have been from a literary perspective. But as I said, I'm interested as a student of public administration, development and politics. And I'm interested in the bureaucracy, the democratic institutions, and I'm interested in how all of this is critiqued by Srilal Shukla, served with black humor and irony. Now, so in some ways, it questions the values on which the new nation is being built, or rather the project of the nation built is already in tatters. It mirrors the reality of what you would call everyday Ragdari or everyday politics. It has a cast of, entirely male characters. And at the center is a person called Vedji, who is this Ayurvedic doctor. And I think it is important to understand that while I am reading this as a text of administration, we are actually not talking about administrators, right? For example, in Rumble and the Village, Jean talks about the different administrative structures, the BDO, the CDO, the DDO, the EDO, the FDO, the GDO, and the HDO. Now, so obviously there are a lot of people who are there, and Srilal Shukla is one of these officers in this village which he's witnessing. But he doesn't talk about the bureaucrats here. Instead, he talks on Vedji, who's an Ayurvedic doctor, who's the one who manages to control everything that happens in this village. He has 2 sons. One is called Rupan Babu, and the other is called Badri Pahalwan. Badri Pahalwan means a wrestler, or really a bully. And there is a character in this novel called Langar, which is lame, literally without a leg. And Langar is supposed to depict the common man, really a person who needs to walk on crutches and can't walk on its own in independent India. And he's always at the receiving end of the state. The other characters in this novel called Shanichar. Shanichar roughly translates as under the influence of Saturn that does not bestow happiness, who was willing to be a sycophant of Vedji, and as a result could prosper and be elected as a village head due to the machinations and blessings of his mentor. There is Vedji's nephew, the Ranganath, a product of post-independent Indian aspirations, who is bewildered about how the state and the nation and its institutions is already mired in corruption. And this is really, let's say, the new India, which is trying to be created, and Ranganath sees the new India being destroyed by the erstwhile elites who have managed to capture these institutions. So Shivpalganj is not just a village in Uttar Pradesh, and in fact, in his first edition itself, Shukla writes शिवपालगंज में जो होता है सारे भारत में होता है. Whatever happens at Shivpalganj happens in the rest of the country. So what did we build and what went wrong? So we built an Indian state adopting Weberian bureaucracy. We built a state based on rationality, centralization of rule-based authority, a model of government that institutionalized the separation of power, the legislature executed blah, blah, blah. You had a policy of separation of policy of administration. The political engagement was really to be at the center where laws were framed and policies drawn. A centralized and professional administration was implemented this through a deconcentrated state. And you really had the decision making, which was done by the MPs and MLAs. And this was done at the capital and not really in village India. And what emerges from Shivpalganj is that there was a mockery of not just sound administrative theories, but sound institutions which were being created. Development, vikas, or nyaya, which is justice, was meted out by the Ved and not by government officials. So here was a formal administrative and political structure, but that was captured completely by informal institutions. Vedji actually determined the nature of state-directed development. So Raag Darbari is in some ways pitted the idealism of the educated against the opportunism of the local elite. And the varied narratives of local power struggle questioned the notion of an independent ideal type bureaucracy. It tested the false dichotomy of separation of powers. It underlined the effective resonance of state institutions were little more than sources of rents for the local elite. And in 2 short decades, what was happening in Shivpalganj was also happening in the rest of India. 1968 is when the Naxalite movement, the Maoist movement, took roots in India, and there was a great awakening against what you might call a bourgeois independent state, and that is a narrative which is also being built up by 68. By the time Shukla writes his 40th anniversary edition, he is actually withdrawing from the notion that this was a fiction and this was a fictitious society. I must say Srilal Shukla must have been disappointed that political scientists were not receptive to his message and craft. And in this 40th edition, he writes, Upanyaskar ko Jantantrik Vidya mante hain. A novel is considered to be democratic knowledge. So let me rephrase it. A novel has no life outside the acceptance of readers. Hence fiction, whether wholly imaginary or only partially so, is accepted, criticized, analyzed, debated in the democratic space, inhabited by the readers. He further writes that the fact that his novel continues to be popular, it is then seemingly authenticated by generations of readers, and in that sense continues to portray a reality that people can relate to. A reality of gaban, dhokadari, bhrashtachar, vanswad, embezzlement, deceit, corruption, hereditary rule. They have made their roots stronger in society. So this is a novel then, which is by now translated into 19 languages, including in English. And it is something which is in print, and it is now being used as a meaningful text by social scientists and administrators. So here a tehsildar had now got promoted as an IAS officer, had got all these literary awards, and as a result, perhaps he did not want the deniability which he wanted in 1968 in his portrayal of reality. Now, from a literary perspectives, there have been many international scholars who've praised him. Rupert Snell, Francisca Orsini, Ulka Anjaria. From the social science perspectives, really, my inspiration is the anthropologist Akhil Gupta. And he uses the novel as a shortcut for his study on corruption. He indicates how difficult it is to write about corruption. Corruption can't be verified, and the language of corruption, the actual asking and taking of money is not literal. There is no evidence of a transaction. There is no concrete contract. Hence, establishing, verifying, providing evidence is so difficult, and how perhaps this fiction is perhaps was the best way to study, to understand corruption. Now, coming from an anthropologist, Gupta calls it the best ethnography of rural India that he's come across. That is saying a lot. Shukla laces his work on corruption with satire and a language of deniability, and not mentioning any particular village. Can we come to next? So next slide. So let's try to understand what I mean on this issue of statecraft. So the distinction between policy making and policy implementation is really attributed to Weber and Wilson. They emphasize an establishment and goals, and detailed execution of policies need to be separate. Weber underlined that the competencies of administrations must be limited in order to counter the administration's undermining of constitutionality and arbitrary exercise of power. Wilson stressed that the administration lies outside the proper sphere of politics. Administrative questions were not political questions. And this is a myth which has survived. It gives each other a deniability, and the discipline of public administration was moved out from political science by the American Political Science Association in 1903, I think. And there have been other people like Leonard White, William Willoughby, and others who have stressed on this dichotomy kind of a debate. As late as 1951, Sayre was writing that the strict dichotomy was the founding theory of public administration. Marini comes in 1971, brings in new public administration, but still in 2001, when James Savara is writing about the dichotomy, they only talk about the dichotomy in terms of two actors, which is the legislatures and the executive. And as I said, both these actors do not have a major role in Raag Darbari. It is really the informal institutions which are very important. And I think that is where I'm invoking Raag Darbari in terms of leading the way in giving us some analysis of the administrative theory which we would like to visualize. On the issue of language, I do want to bring this out. So the word politics in English means power, state, and government. But the word politics in India means Rajniti, which I translate as state policy, which means all state policy is politics. And the Rajniti is considered to be the short form of politics. And so you're really talking about the politics of state policy. So the idea of a separation is something which is not there either, let's say, in Indian administrative thought, which is Kautilya, and I'll come to that in a little, or also in terms of the language which we use, the language where we talk about Rajniti. The second, the bureaucracy is defined as a public servant, and in India we use the word Naukarshahi, which is a servant of the king, or really king of servants. So you're not really, you're giving the administrator a lot more autonomy, and the IAS officials are really kings in many ways across India. So you are really giving a great agency to the administrator rather than the administrator being driven by legislature. So in administrative thought, administrative theory, we talk about this as saying that policy requires a policy of administration. So how you are to administer it, there's a lot of politics within that mechanism, and perhaps that's where that's how we try to resolve it. I'll come to this in a while, but for the moment, let me look at a non-dichotomous, non-Eurocentric perspective, which is found in Kautilya. Next, please. So Kautilya is writing the Arthashastra and the Chanakya Niti at around the 4th century BCE, at the same time as Plato is writing. And he marks a departure from what were the Dharma Shastras, which is some sort of a basis of governance, which lay down the principles or a treatise of administration. Kautilya, like Weber, also provides an ideal type in terms of advice to the king, yet it was an introduction of political economy to the world. Arthashastra has been translated by many people as talking about political economy and providing a theory of politics to deal with concerns of governance. I'm inspired by my ex-colleague in Delhi University, Upinder Singh's work, where she translates Arthashastra as politics as the art of material gain. And Arthashastra is seen as a document of praxis, combining both Shastra, which is knowledge, as well as practice, which is prayog. So this is really a practical rather than an ideal. So while it is an ideal type, he talks about implementing the ideal type in different, which I call dystopian realities, which an administrator comes across. So it is not just a discussion on the bureaucracy as an implementer. The book has chapters on government, law, civil and criminal court systems, ethics, economics, market and trade. And the word Rajniti is really coming from here, which is seen as in terms of administrative terms. He provides an ideal type, but at the same time, he writes about using any political or violent means to protect the king. And by king, he actually means Rashtra, not to be translated as nation. And that Rashtra has to be protected against any anarchy. In some ways, Kautilya also invokes what was there in the Bhagavad Gita, the concept of Lok Samagra, which actually means the idea of welfare for all. So when he talks about the protection at whatever costs, he talks about protection of what has, the acquisition of what has yet to be gained, the preservation of what has to be acquired, and the increase of what has to be preserved, and the bestowal of surplus amongst the deservers. So in many ways, what Kautilya is trying to put forward is a theory of the good for all. And that is why perhaps the use of deceit in Arthashastra is not criticized as much as the Machiavellian writings are in terms of means justify the end, because in some ways, Kautilya is defining what needs to be preserved, and which is the concept of Lok Samagra. Now, can we have the last one, please? The next one, please. Here I come to the last mile. Now, in your Eurocentric administrative theory, much of what you would call the agency of the bureaucrat emerges from the public choice literature in the 1970s, William Niskanen. We have in the 80s, Michael Lipsky talking about street-level bureaucrats. But clearly, and they give a lot of autonomy to the administrator. But really, in both these writings, we only have the frame of talking within the administrative structure and not outside the administrative structure. And this is where I think what Srilal Shukla does to administrative theory is much beyond what Kautilya, Weber, Niskanen, or Lipsky do, which is provides us a political economy of the last mile of administration. A last mile which is not just street-level bureaucrats, but a last mile which is both formal and informal institutions which shape the delivery of developmental outcomes. And this is the last mile, which I have found very inspiring. And that is why Raag Darbari never left me, even though I read it when I was 80. 3 weeks back, I get a message from a young student of mine who's starting his career in UP, and he says, for 5 years, we studied political science in Delhi University, but the one thing which is holding me is your one lecture on Raag Darbari, because everything else which we studied doesn't seem to be making any sense as I negotiate the different forces in this subdivision which I'm kind of managing. So I think that is the kind of a force which Raag Darbari has in terms of understanding the different. So Shukla is writing at a time, he's writing about his work as a tehsildar, he's talking about rural mufassals in UP, and he talks about not policy implementation, but as Anshu put it very, very, very well, of policy mutilation, and which is indeed in terms of the last mile, and how does the last mile get corrupted by politics. So if politics is so bad, you are going to ask me, why is it that I want to invoke him? And if what is emerging from all of this is a way in which institutions kind of get destroyed, then what is the ray of hope in invoking Raag Darbari? Because as I said, Raag Darbari is a work which we haven't been able to use it through an administrative lens of inquiry, because it revolves around Khanna Masterji, it revolves around Vedji, and Vedji uses a lot of Gandhian quotes to project a rhetoric which is solely in his interest and not in the interest of anybody else. I do that because as I have worked on issues of local governance and decentralization, we are in the business of designing institutions for better delivery of resources, and we need to understand where policies go wrong. And this is where the frame of the Eurocentric administrative structure does not help me in designing institutions which are more accountable downwards. And that is where I would like to spend the last 2 minutes here. So can we have that slide which shows the next one, please? Further. Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot further down. Sorry, I forgot all of this. Can we go further down? Okay. So when we talk about the normative administrative model, and when we talk about administrative reforms, this is really the matrix which we work with. This is a matrix where in the center we have the normal administrative architecture, the silos, the departments moving in. We can talk about various kinds of reforms here. We can talk about greater complementarity, give greater participation. So if you look at to your left, you will find the different kinds of actors, the donors, the private sector, the local NGOs, the informal sector, which influence your administrative architecture. And on the right, we have what is called the political architecture, the legislative architecture, which shapes what the governance systems do. We usually work within this matrix. But as I said, when I was working as a governance advisor for the Asia Pacific region, and I was working in about 6 different countries, we realized that this is not a maze which helps us understanding administrative reality. So if we wanted to push for decentralization, if we wanted to get people to have a greater say on environmental protection, we had to look for champions, which could be anywhere within this administrative structure. So I remember 8 of us were shut in a room with UNDP officials and these governance advisors who were working. And we came up with an alternate design. And this is an alternate design which I would say is inspired by Srilal Shukla's work. And this alternate design is in the next one, please. So what we really have is the actual architectures of change are really the Vedjis, the Khanna master, the Shanichars, and the politics which they bring forward. So here we are trying to create, because we were working with the UNDP and we were working with state institutions, we could not, the informal institutions which we were trying to work through, we could not formalize it in different ways apart from saying it's civil society organizations, citizens group, development partnerships, the global networks in terms of cities alliances which come to define how a city needs to be governed, etc. And they don't move from straight lines in a hierarchical Weberian fashion. They move around in curves. They move around in different opportunity structures which are created. So if we have a minister who believes in decentralization and greater accountability, you are able to move very fast in with administrative reform. If you don't have that, then you perhaps need to empower citizens groups to be able to put pressure within the government. So when we start looking at areas of good governance and reforms, we can't just be looking at formal institutions. We can't be looking at a very Eurocentric approach. We need to look at state capacity, which is much more dynamic and which is much more engaged with different kinds of political voices and forces. So yes, these institutions can be captured by the elite, as Srilal Shukla talks about, but there is another task, and that task is of creating an alternate political space. And how does that alternate political space then engage with the formal institutions which are there? And within that, so administration and governance is not seen as something which is simply bureaucratic, but is seen as something which is a culmination of the political and the established administrative structure. And that is an inspiration of the last mile, or the political economy of the last mile, which we get from Srilal Shukla. So can we have the last one, please? So basically, I would like to stop there and with just a few words on how this is being concluded. So the tone of satire is one of ridicule. It is one of despondence, yet it is engaging and informative about village life and the interplay of society and individual agency in everyday governance and politics. Is this satire a realism or an exaggeration? Perhaps a bit of both. Satire is often used when the Socratean dialogical approach to engage with the state fails, or when the state is so far off and powerful that the subalterns engage through ridicule, laughter, and scorn. It brings out the irony. It exaggerates reality. It reduces it to absurdity. It projects a reversal of the normal order. And it is not just sarcasm, but it is a cry for reforms. And it is a cry of, it gives you a mirror of the everyday functioning of state and institutions. Humor brings criticism, makes criticism less caustic. We have to take the satirist, the cartoonist, the stand-up comedian seriously, as Indian mythology has respected the Vidushak or the storyteller. Their fictitious narrative has the ability to call out that the emperor does not have clothes. And at a time when politics is played through fictitious reality, Srilal Shukla's fiction is not just a reality, but a harbinger of administrative thought that balances state and society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Satyajit. Absolutely fascinating, brings a lot of clarity to what one can take away from the book. I believe the priority today is to accumulate comments and questions. So what we'll do is because this is an ongoing project, so what we'll do is anybody who has things to contribute, just type your name in the chat and we'll proceed in the order. I'll group questions and maybe in twos and threes and turn them back to you, Satyajit. Just to get the ball rolling, I'll pose two rather simple questions. Um, both have to do with kind of what has changed since the book was written. Um,
Yeah, sorry.
no, it's okay.
Yeah.
So both questions about what has changed since the book was written and sort of how. I mean, this is a very valuable critique of the state. It's a very valuable source for generating hypotheses about what might be going on when things do not go according to plan. Right. So the two questions. One is 1968. The state and the party were basically the same thing. There were not multiple parties, at least at the national level, doing a lot, and there are no political parties in the book. This is politics without parties. What happens when the parties come back in? If you had to imagine Srilal Shukla writing this book today, or at least sometime since the 1990s, how do you think that would have changed it? The second sort of what if question is thinking about, look, things have changed. There are aspects of governance that have improved and aspects that have lagged and so forth. Where do you see the role of economic growth and the empowerment of new elites in changing how all this happens? And I suppose the third question, which would follow from that, is the balance between the rural and the urban. The urban is in the background here. It's the place from which Rangnath comes. And there's a bunch of fools disconnected in the city far away, but it doesn't really play much of a role beyond that. How has that changed? So those are my sort of three broad questions about what one can take from this. Thanks.
So these are very good questions, and I don't think I'll be able to do justice because these are thought-provoking questions, and I'll have to reflect a little bit more on this. But let me just kind of answer it quickly. Every village is different. I do not find, and that is why every village requires a different kind of an administrative architecture, a different kind of alignment of the formal and the informal, because what social capital exists in Kerala will not be available. So in terms of village, its links with markets, its links with urban and rural would be very, very different. So there isn't a typical Indian village, which I get. And Shivpalganj is also not a typical village, even in 1968. Because even if you did not have political parties, you had a Maoist movement which was emerging, and Srilal Shukla again does not capture that in his reality. So I do not see fiction as a depiction of reality. I see it as a craft. I see it as a craft which helps us put certain questions in my head. So the way I have used Srilal Shukla is in my work is really in terms of, hang on, what is the formal and the informal? And hang on, how do good, well-meaning institutions get subverted? Right? So I read the text very much in terms of trying to figure out where are the nodes of tension, where are the nodes of opportunities which exist, which we can kind of use. So yes, there is no typical village. Political parties is very important, and I began to, really see the importance of political parties when I was working in the Philippines, and I saw that there was nothing called political engagement. So an organization like the BSP, for example, or Ram Vilas Paswan in Bihar, they are institutions in their own right, and any kind of an engagement or any kind of an administrative reforms would need to be engaging with these political parties. And in Philippines, again, I did not find them when we were talking about how do we create rural water institutions, which are representative of the people. And if the poor are not getting represented in these rural water cooperatives, then can we get political parties to organize the poor to bring them in? Those institutions were really not there. So again, how do parties engage is going to be very, very different in different contexts. So I'm not really seeing it as an answer. 1968 and 2020, village life is very different. The opportunity structures, the development state, which was there only in terms of the college, the panchayat and the cooperative. Today you have many, many more developmental agencies and actors which are at play. So I'm not sure if I have been able to answer you correctly, but I think I need to reflect a little bit more there.
Thank you. So we have a question from Bishnu and then from Amit, in that order. Bishnu, would you please speak your question?
Sure. It'll make more if I speak it, I think. So, Satyajit, amazing talk to think about sort of the speculative aspect of fiction, which is almost dismissed as not real, right? But you're making us think of in a different way. And I'm thinking about these characters, in your last model who move up in higher positions, right? And I think the novel proposes that through its cast of characters. And one of the things when you talk about it as ethnography, the characters become exemplary or typified, even though there's no typical village. And that is a long tradition in fiction, right? That a character that you build is typical in a way, is drawn from reality. At the same time, they're also ideational in the sense that R.K. Narayan's, Indian village. So I'm just wondering, I think that Raag Darbari mix of the two because it is speculative in the good way. It's speculative fiction that this statecraft could be actually, even though it's critical of what's happening. So I was just curious about what you think about those two opposing poles.
Let's take a question from Amit too, and then we'll take them together.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Satyajit. This is such a lovely meditation. And I wish we had more such conversations, frankly. I just, and Vishnu, by the way, I just absolutely loved that question. It just made me sort of think about everything just so differently. But let me just talk a little bit. I mean, since we are in a conversation here of sorts, right? The funny thing is that, I have found as in the novel to be a phenomenal device to bring the world that students don't get to interact with, into their lives. That's how I learned teaching when I first started teaching at University of Michigan. We had 16 weeks to work with. And I remember when I was a TA for a course on African politics, we read multiple novels. Chinua Achebe was the first novel we would read for that course. And so in that sense, I just want to reinforce this idea. Raag Darbari is an absolute classic. I've read it in English, but it just doesn't compare the way it reads in Hindi. It's a phenomenal book. That being said, Satyajit, I want to sort of just, go back perhaps to the Eurocentric view, since Eurocentric views pay my salary. And just sort of take you back to, some of the views that we sort of know about. So sort of think about, in some ways, weak states, strong societies. So think about, out of, the citizen subject, stories that Mamdani tells. And my point really generally being is that in some ways, what Raag Darbari is telling us about the elites and elite capture, I mean, this is the sort of standard narrative of post-colonial states, because you get decolonization, and then you get elite capture, and political scientists who sort of tried to sort of wrap their heads around it, and in the same in service of the same objective, which is development, right? However we may want to describe or understand development, which in itself is a very problematic concept. have said, well, there are two ways to do this. One is sort of a classic way where, elite power was destroyed because of one reason or another, where the parties went after elite power. And so in that sense, society was overpowered by the states. The state could actually penetrate, lay roots, and therefore remove these potential distortions that could creep in its functioning. Sometimes war did it, sometimes parties did it, but there are cases when that has happened. The other side of the story comes from a more recent literature, which is now sort of saying that, well, can the state create spaces of contestation within itself? So, for example, I'll give you a story out of UP itself. There is a story, there is basically an entire program where lower caste women are hired, trained, empowered to go and challenge sort of standard views on women's education in villages. Is this easy work? No. Do they have to pick fights with the elites? Yes, and they do. But they are empowered to pick these fights, and some of the outcomes of these programs have actually been quite spectacular. So so this bottom up corrective measure which the state is using to sort of dislodge the kind of powers or the kind of elite capture that Srilal Shukla is sort of pointing to. So I'm just sort of thinking as sort of think about this, in terms of the empirical literature or on state and state functioning that does exist in political science. Because I think Srilal Shukla and Raag Darbari, are not exactly disconnected. I think even if you sort of think about it from the last mile, also the sort of public-facing bureaucrat issues. I mean, a lot of these things are very much in play in these contexts. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Satyajit, let me give you some time to respond, please.
Okay. So, Bishtu, first your question. Really, I think a lot of fiction is speculative, and a lot of fiction is not even is imaginary and not even trying to get to the reality. Some fiction is, and I think Srilal Shukla was, I mean, the tension of your question is really the tension which Srilal Shukla himself feels in 1968 and then at the time of the 40th edition, right? At the time of the 40th edition, perhaps it is also a time when we as political scientists start wondering whether there is more to Srilal Shukla than just a fiction, just a novel. My engagement with this was really in terms of, as we both put it, an item number. And then the response which I got was absolutely amazing. In terms of political scientists coming in from all over the world and writing papers and engaging with this particular person, and engaging with a fiction which they did not found speculative, but they found it to be ethnography. They found it to be a depiction of reality, again in a very, I would say, the imaginary ways of Shukla has never left us in trying to understand social sciences. And that is why I am not, as a political scientist, I'm not coming to conclusions from Srilal Shukla's. Rather, I use Srilal Shukla as pointers to the way I would approach a particular problematic. So those are some initial thoughts. I think this is a point of a larger conversation. And I mean, thank you for bringing in all of that. Yes, in the half an hour that I had, I could not bring the critical issues and the actual changes in discourses which is taking place in the field as a result of what you would call building alternate capacity, building alternate state capacity, or building social capital to be able to deal with these issues. And I think this overarching frame which I'm trying to pull together is really a frame which where we need to look. So the frames which I get from Eurocentric approaches is a frame which does not help me address many of these issues. Within, I mean, you are referring to political scientists who are able to talk about state-society engagements. I am actually referring to works in administrative thought, where there is a huge gap, and this particular intervention is really in terms of dealing with it. But yes, the idea is that why should we let elites build their informal mechanisms and encash their social capital to be able to subvert the benefits which are directed towards the poor? Why can't we create an alternate social capital? And the task of creation of those alternate social agencies and institutions is actually an administrative task in itself. How do you create processes? How do you, so when you're talking about decentralization, you have two, I mean, within the overarching framework, you have two models of looking at it. One is a deconcentration model, and the other is a devolution model. So the moment you opt for a devolution model, you then can build much more in terms of an alternate political culture than you would be able to do there. So in some ways, and this is again coming to you in some ways, Vishnu, are we using Srilal Shukla as a shorthand for our academic engagement, right? Does he give you a hook to be able to give weight, momentum, and leverage to ideas which are already in process, right? I could have continued working in the space I do without reference to Srilal Shukla. And am I referring to Srilal Shukla simply because there is greater momentum in terms of understanding a reality which is so non-Western, so non-Nehruvian, so different, so earthly in some ways, and whether we are trying to engage in that process. I'm not sure I've answered either of you correctly, but but I think there is a conversation which is in place.
Okay. Thanks. Next two questions. First, we'll hear from Jan, then we'll hear from Daniel. By the way, people are putting questions and comments in the stack. We have people who may not be able to read the stack, so I'm going to ask people to make their contributions verbally when recognized, please. So Jan first, then Daniel.
Satyajit, thanks. Now, a note, before we get to the last mile, let's consider also the first mile and what goes before the first mile, and view Weber's perspective as a fiction, a narrative that is imported from France, and the notion of autonomous bureaucracy that then is to play a role in Germany, which has been excluded from the European trend since 1648. And then my notes are, one, in the Indian case, if we look at the sociology of Indian governments, one, layers of colonialism, Raj, Mughals, and then British, and the whole phenomenon of the inheritor state, of which Sudipto Kaviraj said there is in India a major gap between state and society. And you see that in Chatterjee also. So this adds a to a sociology of Indian government, and we can go into the particulars of that, which you do via Raag Darbari. But at the same time, we can make a wider move now in contemporary times and think of Ulrich Beck, risk society. Decisions are increasingly made in laboratories and boardrooms. And we can add other layers and so forth. Multivocality and so forth. And think of Dominic Cummings' comments on Boris Johnson's civil service in England. You get another very caustic intervention. So there is a lot going on, and the first mile is still very problematic. Thanks.
Yes, it is. And I think my reaction or my assumption here is that the first mile in many ways, or at least in all these models which you're talking about, the assumption is that the first mile is the most important because that shapes the last mile. And what my engagement with Raag Darbari tells us is that the design, you can't leave administrative designs to just the first mile, because if you leave it to just the first mile, then either it becomes an agency for the bureaucrat, or it becomes an agency of the members of the Legislative Assembly to enact their will on all administrative aspects of that particular district. And when you talk about democracy, this opens up the other issue of democracy. You're talking about a representative democracy. Are you talking about a direct democracy? And in India now we have, and this is also in some ways answering to Aashish's questions, you also have Panchayati Raj. And Panchayati Raj has been given certain functions by the Constitution. So you have a union list, you have a state list, you have a concurrent list, and now you have a Panchayati Raj and municipal lists. So these are administrative functions which have now been given to the last mile. Now, should the last mile be looking upwards, or should the last mile be looking for greater accountability downwards? I think that is a tension which I'm trying to capture, which is a different way than the construction of by Kaviraj and Chatterjee in terms of their understanding of state and society. They see the state as up there, and I am seeing state institutions as down there. And these are the state institutions in action, which changes the way in which people's lives are run.
Should I just continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you very much. I actually indeed also tried once to make sense of this last mile of governance, failed completely, and see now that I should have written a novel. Probably maybe that would have been the exit to somehow make sense of what I saw and did there in Nicaragua. Anyways, my question would be to somehow get back into theory, because there's a particular form of critique against Eurocentrism I like very much, which is to point out the limits of the theories that we have so far at hand. And I wonder if you could exemplify this a little bit on the terms of legitimacy. You already brought in Max Weber, so maybe we could try to see the offers he has to make sense of legitimacy in this last mile. And maybe you could show us with what you learned from the Indian case and what we learned through this novel, what kinds of forms of legitimacy there are at play we can't see by only thinking with Weber. If that question was clear enough, or yes.
So Weber talks about the different forms of legitimacy which are there, and he tries to show the superiority of the legal rational type, and he builds on a legal rational legitimacy structure. And I think in terms of theory, it stands. I think the problem really comes is in terms of how he talks about the separation of the politics. I mean, from the node which I'm really holding on to is the separation of politics and administration. And a separation of politics and administration is in some ways centralizing, extractive. It helps that kind of an architecture, and an assimilation of politics and administration perhaps gives more democratic space to people, right? So legitimacy, as I'm seeing it of the last mile within a democratic context, is very different from how Weber constructs it. Weber is also, in some ways, there is. If you look at Weber's earlier writings and you look at contrast it with his engagement with the administrative state, you would find that Weber is actually trying to make sure that the educated elite who form the upper crust of the bureaucracy, they are in some ways protected from the political whims and fancies, right? So this is also an engagement which comes, let's say, from the Yes Minister TV serial, coming from a British perspective, or of bureaucrats in India in the 50s and 60s trying to manage the politicians. And now we have the bureaucrats in India who have become completely subservient to the elected representatives at the level of MPs and MLAs or the government formation, and not accountable, let's say, to the lower echelons of the Panchayati Raj structure. So I think the forms of legitimacy which we are trying to seek, I don't know whether it can be informed by Weber, whether the legal rational way which Weber creates is still something which has basis. I would say yes. What follows from that legal rational structure, where he creates an administrative structure which is not really accountable downwards, and also something where he makes the bureaucracy a subservient to the rules and procedures and not enact on outcomes. I think the problem, if I was to recreate an understanding of legitimacy, I mean, those are the points which I'll try to thread together. Yes, Vibhu.
So yeah, it's 2:00 at night here. So if you can allow me to ramble a little bit, and just humor me on that. So I think so. Just one thing on the novel itself. I mean, the kind of dystopian part of it, and this whole thing of a kind of distant setting. And at one level, that sort of reminds me of, and since we're talking about the West and the East and all that stuff, Border Country. That's Raymond Williams. I think it was his only novel there. And that's the sort of kind of story of, again, like Raag Darbari, there is this kind of city-educated, naive brat who goes to this village in Wales. I think there the focus is actually about transformation. Yeah. So this goes back to the very first intervention in terms of what has kind of changed here. Whereas here there is this sort of sense of non-change, which is kind of, which at least I took back from that novel. So that's, but in a sense, both the change and the non-change then become an illustration of dystopia. So that for me is quite interesting, that there is this, that dystopia can cut both ways here. So that's kind of the first sort of ramble here. The second thing, I mean, for me is, and this is sort of I don't think this came up in the in that wonderful seminar you had, Satyajit. But this whole idea of, I mean, the term last mile has sort of come up here. So as the first mile, Jan brought that up. So where I come from, there's broadly kind of communication studies. Yeah, this last mile is this kind of mirage, in a sense. It's this kind of moving target. Yeah, it's something which is always to surmount the last mile is a desire. Okay, so telegraph in the last mile, radio in the last mile, television in the last mile, mobile phones in the last mile, and of course, the internet in the last mile. The last mile is this problem, yeah, okay, which may or may not assume that the first mile has been sorted out, yeah, okay. But the big problem that's being presented is that of the last mile, yeah. So that's kind of the second sort of piece they had, and that links to perhaps what could be a question is I mean, the last mile of the state, and I don't know how this would seem to political scientists, but the last mile of the state as an apparatus, as opposed to the last mile of the state as an interest, and for me, there is perhaps something in that tension there. So, I mean, and you were talking about Kaviraj, but, Bardhan as well, the whole idea of the nature of the state, at least in the 80s and 90s and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, I mean, I do appreciate the tension between the first and the last mile, and that's something worth thinking about. Yeah. But also at the last mile itself, the tension between the avatar of the state as an apparatus, which is essentially what you have been focusing on, Satyajit. And then this idea of the state at the last mile, how does it function and reveal itself as an interest? There are parts of that very much there in the novel, that the state is trying to reach out besides the bureaucracy, but trying to reach out to sort of convey its own norms and values. Yeah, the whole sort of section on advertisements and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering whether there's something there to look at this tension of the duality between the last mile apparatus and the interest of the last mile. And then over that, perhaps, or rather use that tension to then look at the question which was raised right at the beginning in terms of what has changed. Yeah, so it's a 2 a.m. question. So
no, it's a very thoughtful one, and I mean, listening to this discourse and also taking up from where Vishnu and Jan pointed out, I think I think perhaps the hook to tie it all together is by not constructing it as politics, but constructing as a democratic engagement, which would then be part of a state narrative, which would perhaps then resolve the tensions between the first and the last mile. Because if you look at institutions of democratic practice, rather than just the administrative architecture, then I think we could be holding on to both the Eurocentric criticism as well as a political economy narrative to take this forward. But I need to think a little bit more in terms of what you talked about, the change and the non-change, and within that there are problems within that, within both those kinds of narratives. I think is something I need to think about. Thank you for those. Thank you for those comments.
We have 3 questions on Stack. We'll start with Andrea, then Anshu. Let you answer those, and then we'll come to Kim. So, Andrea?
Sorry, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry because I had some problem with the connection and I probably don't heard all the presentation. Anyhow, I was wondering if as fiction as a tool, a craft for governance, if you see a connection between narratives, fictions, and the creation of expectation, because in this case, well, I would like to know if you see this connection, and in this case, the importance of the tool for governance would be clear in a certain sense. That's my question.
So I think that there is a disciplinary way of approaching it from a very humanities perspective. You would say that history is also fiction. History is also an interpretation. A photograph is also an interpretation. And as a result, narratives become very, very important. The Greeks had these terminology, which they call the mythos and the logos, I think, which is what can't be verified is mythology, and what can be verified is logos, which is reality. So I think this tension is there, has been there for a long, long time. I like narratives. I like stories because stories give you an understanding of a reality which data doesn't give you. I like stories with emotions because they point to pain, they point to deprivation, they point to different interpretations of hunger. So unlike a measure of poverty, for example, which is based on calories or income or expenditure, Robert Chambers did this whole poverty from below perspective, and the how do poor see what poverty is all about, and what are the words they use to describe poverty. I like that, simply because while we do get a measure from, let's say, an economic understanding of poverty, we do not understand the various dimensions of poverty without an engagement to the emotions which are there. So I like stories, and I like, and that's where I think ethnography is very important. But just like I talked about the photographer and the cartoon, I don't see it as any of them being a substitute for the other. I see that as enriching the other in terms of the analysis. So what I mean today, what Trump created or what Modi is creating in India is a fictitious reality. It's a post-truth world where a narrative can get agency to be said that is the truth. And I think the problem is really in terms of addressing those tensions. So thanks for that thought. You're absolutely right.
Okay, Anshu and then Kim.
Hi, thanks, Satyajit. And this is just, both as a critique of the novel, that the novel does not, in fact, have any women characters at all. I think there's one sort of love interest for someone, and that's the only, I think, woman who appears in the whole novel. So I would like you to reflect on what does that mean? Does that mean that women are completely powerless without agency, or is it something that he's unable to tap? Or is it that women are lesser citizens in 1968? It's some kind of a bias that the state has. I mean, there's been, for example, lots of very interesting literature on the moment of partition and the choicelessness of women caught on the other side, the ones who were abducted and kidnapped and then forcibly brought back to the correct religious community and the correct nation, right? So there's a kind of a powerlessness women have. They're almost like non-citizens, right? So is that what this novel is in a sense reflecting? Or is it just something that one should be criticizing Srilal Shukla for? And I would, I mean, considering that there have been administrative moves to include women in, for example, the Panchayati Raj, system, and so on. So how has that changed at the ground level? We know, for example, that women's vote matters one hell of a lot these days. So how women actually are voting is determining the government that's coming into power, So how is that reality in some senses both changing on the ground and that this should actually be a very sharp critique of someone like Srilal Shukla, that he is unable to actually create a more complex reality. There should be ways in which women, even if they do not have formal structures of, power or engagement with the state, I'm sure there are informal ways in which they influence things, which Srilal Shukla is unable to tell us about. So, it comes from these two streams.
Yeah, and I would say you're absolutely right. And I would say it could just be a masculine bias of an upper caste male writing at that point of time. I don't think there is a Muslim depiction either in his village. So that is again a category. The tribals, this might be plain, so there might not be a tribal depiction, which is coming in there. Were there any state agencies or institutions which were gender focused in 1968 vis-a-vis the panchayat, the cooperatives, or the college? They weren't. Panchayati Raj structure has changed considerably. So yes, this is a fiction, and that is why I'm not really in complete awe of Akhil Gupta to call it one of the best ethnographical works which he has read of independent India. I think they are much stronger and powerful ethnographical works which deal with it. So I see it as a work of fiction, but I see it as a work of fiction which in many ways mimics society, and women are absent from the political spaces. So yes, there is a process of change. The Shanichar is a very powerful figure in Indian politics today, which he wasn't at that point of time. He was playing to the whims and fancies of a Brahmin mentor. So yeah, there are various. I think half of your electorate is today women, and we have new initiatives like gas chulhas and toilets for women and other kinds of developmental initiatives which has happened, which does give them agencies. So yes, Srilal Shukla has to be critiqued on that one. I think he was asked a question in a press conference about the missing women, and he did say that if I was to write a novel again, there would be more women characters in that novel, but that is something we have to red flag him on.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed this very much. Now I'm coming from a very different place than I think most of the people on this call, in that I know very little about India. But as you were talking and you showed your charts, I saw nothing as far as collectivity, physical interest, or even violence. And where I'm coming from is from the Philippines, and that tremendous amounts of physical violence at the local level. I started my research out there in 1986. By 1988, there were over 200 identified death squads running around. Every trade union leader I met south of Luzon was identified by name on a death squad list. And I don't know if you, and maybe you don't even want to touch this, which would be fine, but I'm just coming from a different viewpoint, trying to see how this might connect or interact or perhaps cause you to reflect a little differently than, say, just keeping it in a totally Indian context. Thank you.
Kim, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of work on state capacity and conflict, and it is all around issues of negotiation. It is on issues of dialogue. It is in terms of giving greater participation avenues for people who have been. So within the context of ethnic conflicts and strife, there is a whole literature, and the decentralization literature is in many ways representing that, because they say that if you're a minority, then the subjects are best governed at the local level for you, because the moment it goes to a higher level, then the democratic space in architecture to negotiate your interest becomes smaller, right? So like Modi in India, he has decided that the 12% of the Muslims don't matter. And as a result, if Muslim interests were catered at the local level, where even if they are a minority, there is a greater response to their needs. So in terms of the crafts which we have of greater decentralization, the issues of conflicts and transition from conflict to a democratic regimes, there's a whole literature on local governance which we are careful about. So yes, the slide which I showed you, the second slide particularly, we tried to give picture of spaces which would be a model for everything else. But you're right, that slide needs, I mean, you could talk about women's group, you could talk about different kinds of identity, ethnic kinds of issues. The question, however, does remain is, do these various groups want to come at the local government table for negotiation? Or do they want that the writ is large? For example, in India, we have the Maoist movement.
Right.
And the Maoist movement, and in some ways the Panchayati Raj institutions, which are supposed to be representative of the people, they don't function together. The panchayats would want more education institutions to run. The Maoists would not want any state developmental activity to run. So there are tensions and constraints there. Strangely enough, the Maoists would also like certain extractive industries to run, simply because that would be a source of revenue for them. So mining, while government schools can't run in parts of Chhattisgarh in India, mining companies are running simply because there are, so what is, I'm not at all trying to generate the entire Naxal movement with this particular example, but there is a political economy also in terms of what state initiatives are perceived, are allowed to run, and what state activities like education, which is more visible. Trucks moving out in the night, they are not visible. And as a result, that mining extraction is taking place. But the developmental state, in terms of running schools and hospitals, that is visible. And as a result, that is attacked. So clearly, I think there are a lot of tensions in terms of who wants to come to the table and what do they want to discuss on. So the opportunities of the state to be able to provide Platforms for engagement are also restricted, and there may be certain actors which don't want to come to the table.
Well, I was thinking particularly in light of labor. You know, and so some people don't want labor to come to the table, that they want to want them excluded and pushed away, where, and like I say, in the Philippines, where they've used extensive violence to do such, particularly against the KMU, if you know.
Yeah.
So thank you. That's okay.
Okay, I think it's time we bring the proceedings to a close. I'd like, Satyajit, thank you very much for this. This was extremely interesting. Thank you, everybody, for wonderful questions. Great conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Jan for a few closing words here. Thanks.
Satyajit, thank you very much. And Aashish, for chair, Brett, Katie Randon, all for assistance, and greets to people who are still from Rome, from Delhi, earlier, from Kathmandu. And so I also like very much that this is an international rendezvous, a meeting place, different views come together. Folks, just a closing note, thanks to everybody for this spring cycle. We'll continue in fall, and we are now in the phase of bringing all the sheep together. We'll be in touch later. Thank you very much. Hi, thanks.